Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience as we let everybody in. I'm Jane Ward. I'm president of the Friends of the Edgewater Library. Welcome to this afternoon's program, Mollie's War. The program is sponsored by Friends of the Edgewater Library and Edgewater Village, Chicago, a volunteer nonprofit organization offering programs, social activities, and resources geared to older adults. And as always, this program is made in partnership with the Edgewater Branch Library. We will have website info for all of the organizations in our chat. Please check these out when you have a minute. This will be a really information-filled afternoon, and in order to make sure it runs smoothly, let me quickly run through some procedure before I move on to the introduction. In a couple of minutes, the only person you'll see on your screen is our presenter, Cyndee Schaffer. At the start of the program, Friends of the Edgewater Library muted your video and audio. This courtesy eliminates interruptions to our speakers. Please don't try to unmute yourselves. We will unmute you when it's appropriate to do so. We are recording this program for playback on the Friends website. By registering, you've given Friends of the Edgewater Library permission to use your image and voice when applicable as part of that recording and its future use online. We'll have a question and answer period at the end of the talk. Again, keep the chat box open and type your questions in there and hit enter to send them. During the Q&A period, I will be asking the questions on your behalf. Because our speaker can't see your reactions today, I also want to point out there's a reaction button down at the navigation bar too, where you can give her a little applause or a thumbs up if you like something that she's talking about, and that'll help her know as she goes along that she's hitting the mark. Once the program has ended, we'll unmute you for the last few minutes, and you can speak directly with our guest. This is your chance to ask any last-minute questions, so please hang on Zoom after the Q&A period wraps up. And now we move into the program. Joining us today is Cyndee Schaffer. Cyndee is president of the Midwest Writers Association and co-author of the award-winning Mollie's War, a book made in collaboration with her 91-year-old mother, based on the letters that her mother sent home to her family while serving as a WAC, a member of the Women's Army Corps, while stationed in Europe during World War II. Cyndee has been a high school math teacher in the city of Chicago, an IT consultant, and finally an author. Her status as an Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholar since 2015 has allowed her to bring this program all throughout the state of Illinois, in large cities and small towns alike. About her mother's remarkable life, Cyndee says, "Before World War II, my mother worked as a medical transcriber for the Veterans Hospital in Dearborn, Michigan. This led her to serving in medical intelligence as a medical transcriber/secretary. When she joined the Army, she told them she didn't want a job filing paper clips. We can safely say her wish came true." Please join me in welcoming Cyndee Schaffer and her presentation, Mollie's War. Cyndee, over to you.
Thank you very much for joining me. I am now going to share my screen, and this usually takes a couple minutes. And I always have to make sure that I share the computer sound along with it. It's coming there. Well, thank you for joining me for Mollie's War. Today we celebrate the 101st Veterans Day and the 102nd anniversary of the end of World War I. Let's take a moment to remember our veterans, both male and female, and thank them for their continuing sacrifices and service so that we can live our lives in freedom. Veterans Day marks the anniversary of the signing of the Armistice in a railway car in a forest north of Paris in 1918, which ended the First World War. The Armistice was signed and took effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1918 bringing to a close what was termed the Great War. Initially proclaimed on November 11, 1919, by President Woodrow Wilson as Armistice Day and also Remembrance Day, the date of November 11th was set aside in the United States to commemorate the armistice signed between the Allies of World War I and Germany for the cessation of hostilities. This date is also celebrated in Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Australia, and New Zealand. 76 years ago on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1944, my mother witnessed an historic moment as she watched the parade down the Champs-Élysées in Paris on Armistice Day. Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle welcomed the Allied troops in a newly liberated Paris. And here's an excerpt from the letter that she sent home. Paris, France, 12 November 1944. Dear Beck, must tell you about the Armistice Day parade here in Paris. Florence and myself left the office at 10:30 a.m. and we made a beeline for the Champs-Élysées, one of the main streets in Paris that runs into the Arc de Triomphe. The people were packed like sardines. Florence and I were standing on tiptoes, but we couldn't see very much. We walked farther on and we decided to stand back near the buildings, away from the crowds along the streets. We did have a better view. We saw Churchill go by in a car, but we weren't quite sure. However, when we heard the people shouting, "Viva Churchill," that confirmed it. Besides, I had said to Florence, I know we have a long-range view of the parade, but no one but Churchill's cheeks are puffed out like that. The 1-minute silence at 11 a.m. brought to mind the folks back home. Wonder when we'll be coming home. I know, Beck, it won't be too soon. I hope we don't have to fight this war over again in 20 years. In 1953, Alvin King of Kansas, a shoe repair shop owner and an active member of the American War Dads during World War II, began a campaign to turn Armistice Day into Veterans Day to honor all veterans. With the assistance of U.S. Representative Ed Wees from Kansas, a bill was passed through Congress designating November 11th as Veterans Day and was signed into law by President Dwight D. Eisenhower on May 26, 1954. There is a quote etched into the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. from Colonel Oveta Culp-Hobby, the first commanding officer of the WACs, who later became the first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Women who stepped up were measured as citizens of the nation, not as women. This was a people's war, and everyone was in it. The role of a woman in the military has changed over the years. Today, when you read and hear about women in the military, it is not uncommon for female soldiers to be assigned alongside male soldiers in the combat areas. But it was not always this way. In 2015, 2 women graduated from the Army's Elite Ranger School. Then in 2016, women could begin applying for the Navy SEAL program. In June 2019, Brigadier General Laura Yeager became the first woman to assume command of a U.S. Army Infantry Division. In July 2020, Jody Daniels was promoted to Lieutenant General. She is the 35th Chief of the U.S. Army Reserve, the first woman in history to occupy this post. During the First World War, women other than nurses were not officially part of the military. Any roles that they served were as volunteers, such as communication specialists or dietitians. But because they were volunteers, they had no official status. The concept of a woman in uniform was difficult for the American public of the 1940s to accept. And my mother is marching in this picture. She's in the first row, the person wearing glasses. However, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the United States entrance into World War II, women's roles began to change. Congress passed a bill on May 14, 1942, to form the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC. Since they were an auxiliary corps, they did not have the same access to legal benefits and protection as the soldiers in the Army. Because so many men were going to war, it became apparent that women's participation in the war effort was essential. Many women learned new skills in industrial jobs, hence Rosie the Riveter. Other women joined the military effort because good clerical and secretarial skills were extremely desirable. The Army discovered an added bonus. One WAC typist could replace 2 men while eating half as much food as 1 man. Once General Eisenhower brought the Auxiliary Corps to North Africa in January 1943, and their efficiency became known, requests for them increased in Europe prior to D-Day. But if these women were being sent overseas, they needed the protection of being part of the Army. So in July 1943, after much debate, another bill was passed in Congress giving women in the Army full military benefits, and they became the WACs, WAC, Women's Army Corps. Serving overseas was considered such a privilege that many WACs gave up promotions and more interesting stateside assignments. There were about 150,000 WACs serving in the Army. 20,000 served overseas, and of those, about 8,000 were serving in the European Theater of Operations, and my mother was one of those 8,000. This also included a battalion commanded by Major Charity Adams of about 800 African American WACs who were assigned in February 1945 to the Central Postal Battalion in Birmingham, England. They were responsible for the redirecting of mail to all of the US personnel in the European Theater of Operations. And this included Army, Navy, Marines, civilians, and Red Cross workers, over 7 million people. When the mail could not be delivered to the address on the envelope, it was sent to the postal directory to be redirected. They manually updated the information card for each person in this theater. At one point, there were 7,500 Robert Smiths. And remember, this was all done without the use of computers. All of these groundbreaking women who joined the military paved the way for future generations of women in the military. Imagine you are a young woman in the 1940s. The world's involvement in World War II, as well as America's, had been raging on for several years. The media continued with their campaign to urge women into the workforce. Here is a quote from the women's recruiting movement of the 1940s. "Never in history has there been such an urgent need for American women to serve their country. This is total war, a war in which every woman, as well as every man, must play a part. My mother, Mollie Weinstein, joined the WAC in September 1943 because she thought it was her patriotic duty. Our journey to writing and publishing a book began when my mother enlisted in the WAC. WACs were an essential part of the fighting forces in World War II, even though they were not in combat. They handled highly classified material, worked long hours with few days off, and were exposed to a significant amount of danger. WACs assisted in the planning of D-Day and subsequent operations. To meet the European theater's heavy demands for skilled typists and stenographers, recruiting was stepped up. The All States campaign and the Job Station campaign. In the first, General Marshall asked state governors to assign committees of prominent citizens the task of recruiting statewide companies for the WAC, who would carry their state flags and wear their own state armbands while in training. My mother was from Detroit, Michigan, and this is the armband that she wore. Her family didn't throw anything out. The Job Station campaign allowed recruiters to promise prospective enlistees their choice of duty and assignment location after they completed basic training. My mother had several reasons for enlisting in the WAC. A favorite cousin was killed in the South Pacific in a flying accident early in the war. 2 of her girlfriends enlisted. And then she looked around and said, there won't be any men left my age. I might as well join. And at the time she was 27, so she was a little bit older than a lot of the people enlisting. At first, when she tried to enlist, she was rejected because of low weight. She weighed less than 100 pounds. In order to enlist, you have to be at least 5 feet tall, weigh 100 pounds, and have at least 12 teeth. You have to ask your dentist about that one. She went home and fattened herself up. Then she was accepted into the WAC and on her way to a new adventure in wartime Europe. She wrote extensively to her sister, and her sister saved this correspondence. She was in the medical intelligence section in the Army. Medical intelligence was established by the Army Surgeon General to provide medical and health-related information about the areas in which the Army was preparing to move into, so that medical services would be prepared for the conditions they would find when the troops arrived. My mother's responsibilities included determining the availability of hospital beds for the next military operation and working as a stenographer for a senior medical officer. She took dictation on medical intelligence activities on belligerent nations, handled all secret and confidential material, maintained all files. Wartime military censorship prevented any detailed discussion of her job in letters to family and friends. There was an article about medical intelligence in Collier's magazine and reprinted in the Reader's Digest in 1943. I was able to locate a copy of that article. In summary, medical intelligence was the difference between an army ready for action and an army ready for the hospital. And this was all accomplished without the use of instant access in the internet. They relied on old information from World War I, maps, and local civilian accounts. Mollie's War recreates a world that existed more than 75 years ago by taking you through the romantic and always frightful journey of an American WAC during the height of World War II. It is not a tale of life on the battlefield, but rather a tale of the battlefield of life and love. Mollie's story documents the human side of life during the war, a life that alternates between fear and romance, exhaustion and leisure. She was assigned and completed basic training in Daytona Beach, Florida, which was the second training camp for WACs after the Army discovered the harsh winters in Iowa. In Florida, you usually didn't need winter clothes. Then her first assignment was in Wilmington, California, where on the day she arrived, as luck would have it, Warner Brothers Studio was just finishing up a WAC recruiting movie, and she became an extra. And here's an excerpt from the letter that she sent home about her role in the movie. 12 February 1944. Dear Beck, all we WACs assembled in the Port Theater for the premiere showing of It's Your War Too. Before the picture was shown, our commanding officer made a little speech and said that many of the scenes were cut out, not because they were bad, but because of the continuity and because it was necessary to make it short. I naturally thought the brief scenes I was in were cut because I had come in on the last day and there were no retakes on my dramatic scenes. I was watching the picture intently as it progressed. It's really just a group of scenes. And my gal friend sitting next to me said, "There you are." It was funny that I hardly recognized myself. It was the coverall scene. I don't look too hot, but it's not too bad. Then I saw myself in the conference scene. But anyway, it was quite a thrill to see it. When we all got through seeing the picture, we came back to the barracks, ate supper, and got our clean linens. Then we all set to work, cleaning and scrubbing for Saturday's inspection. There are no temperamental stars in our barracks. And now It's Your War Too. This film is so politically incorrect for our time, but not for the 1940s. And if you don't hear the sound, I hope somebody is able to tell me that.
There goes one of those petticoat soldiers now.
Yeah. My sister wants to join the WACs. What do you think of that?
She's crazy. What the devil's a woman want to be a soldier for?
Just a waste of time. This is a man's war. What sort of jobs can they do?
What sort of jobs can we do? Take a look, mister. X-ray technicians, inspectors of Army meat, teachers schooling our soldiers. WACs are classification experts, assignment interviewers.
So this is a man's war, is it? WACs are at work on every sort of Army vehicle, doing every sort of motor transport job, testing walkie-talkies, testing radio tubes. Those are just a few of the jobs they do. There are 239 more. Hey, you two armchair generals on the porch, here's something more for you to think about. Listen.
General Eisenhower said, "In many jobs, WACs do the work of two men. The Army needs and can use all it can get."
And listen to the women of the United Nations. They too have some ideas on the subject. The English with their calm courage, the stalwart women of heroic Russia, the Canadian and Australian women, the women of China with their undying fortitude, and tens of thousands of American WACs. What are their ideas on the subject? Listen.
We shall live up to the legends of our fighting men.
Where did these thousands come from? Where will the United States Army get thousands more? Thousands to back up manpower for battle abroad. Who are the women who will help retain the needed manpower for the production battle at home? Who are the women who will help fight our country's war? It's Mary Jones, Jane Doe. It's the idle housewife and the girl next door. Oh, yes, it's your war, too, Miss and Mrs. America.
Here at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, one of the most beautiful Army posts in the world, we, the newly hatched WACs, gather to learn what all the shooting's about. Our kind of shooting. From morning till night, we hustle through a very novel, interesting life. Not just classes and drill and duty, but all kinds of women's sports and recreation. We work hard and play hard. We learn that the Army's privileges as well as its hardships are ours. We get furlough rates on trains, special prices at theaters, special life insurance rates. We know that the rumors about the WACs are so much hot air. Scratch that one out. Off-duty, rayon, or whatever you can get.
You can't use makeup.
No rouge.
No lipstick.
No nail polish. No rouge.
No lipstick.
No nail polish. No rouge.
No lipstick.
No nail polish. No rouge.
Toss that one in the ash can.
Everybody's hair is alike. The same old hairdo. The same old hairdo. The same.
Nonsense. Our hairdress is up to us as long as it's neat, smart, and off the collar.
All work and no fun. All work and no fun.
Strictly Axis propaganda.
From WAC training centers at Fort Oglethorpe and at Des Moines, WACs go forth to Army posts, camps, specialist schools, air bases, to every part of the United States. Savannah, St. Louis, Newport, Baton Rouge, Seattle, Santa Barbara. To Washington, our nation's capital, come hundreds of WACs, many to be stationed in the famous Pentagon building and attached to the combined chiefs of staff.
Turning her head.
WACs are entrusted with tasks involving the utmost secrecy. Here, the important work of decoding messages whose information must be carefully guarded and transcribed with perfect accuracy. At Aberdeen Proving Grounds, valuable men have been released for combat duty by WACs, inspecting mammoth tanks, computing ordnance firing tables for the light, accurate American carbines, the carbines that have canceled the effectiveness of many a Nazi and many a Jap. Here, they also check the efficiency of remote control units and make secret ballistic measurements. These are just a few of the important and interesting jobs done by WACs. At air bases here and overseas, women soldiers perform over 25 technical jobs. War jobs now, but civilian careers later on.
We are in the machine shop, in the repair shop. We rig the parachute. We guide our flyers home.
Altitude 5,000 feet. 5000. Request landing instructions.
Metro Field Tower to Army 3131. Circle field twice at 3,000 feet.
Let me in, will you? I've got a heavy date tonight.
Keep your chute on, Lieutenant. Field won't be clear for 5 minutes.
Potential American pilots are taught blind flying by our WACs. They are taught to handle night raids over Europe and the Black Pacific, taught to navigate safely through black space, loaded with hidden peril. Thousands of WACs volunteer for overseas duty, eager to serve in the actual theater of operations, the goal toward which they've worked and trained. Wherever the American armies will go, WACs may follow. Women have proven their definite value in England, in North Africa, in Algiers, in New Caledonia, India, and Egypt. Every WAC making the war shorter by a month, a week, a day, a minute. Yes, wherever the American armies will go, WACs may follow. To Berlin and Tokyo, too. Ladies and gentlemen, General Marshall.
The Women's Army Corps is an integral part of the Army of the United States, and its members, who are soldiers in every sense of the word, perform a full military part in this war. There are hundreds of important Army jobs which women can perform as effectively as men. In fact, we find that they can do some of these jobs much better than the men. As more and more American soldiers engage the enemy in combat, women must replace them at overseas bases and at posts in this country. In view of the urgency of the situation, enlistment in the military service should take precedence, in my opinion, over any other responsibility except imperative family obligation.
In 1918, we were on the sidelines.
When the war has been won, the women in the Army will march shoulder to shoulder with the men in the great victory parades that will celebrate the return of peace to the world.
After her assignment in Wilmington, California, my mother went back home to Detroit on leave. And this is a picture of my mother with her mother and her older sister, Rebecca, and most of her letters were written to her sister, Rebecca. Then she went to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, which was the staging area for WACs going overseas. She was stationed in England before the D-Day invasion began, and also while the country was under bombardment by the unmanned German bombs. Censorship prevented her from discussing her job, but here is an interesting letter. Yesterday, I went to see Madame Tussauds' famous waxworks. It's amazing how lifelike those figures are. In fact, as I walked in, I started to speak to the girl attendant to ask where we could purchase programs, and was most chagrined when I discovered it was a wax figure. I turned around to see if anyone had noticed my slight error. Then I walked cautiously about and decided not to speak to any of the attendants. You can imagine my further embarrassment when we were about halfway through at the exhibition and started to go on to another floor. I edged up pretty close to a figure at the head of the stairs and stared at it quite frankly. And then he spoke to me. It was a male attendant, and I understand he has been fooling the public for about 15 years. Although I can't tell you anything about my job, other than it is medics and is now secretarial, it is most interesting. The following letter sets the tone for the book. It is now after D-Day, June 6, 1944, and the Allies have made great strides into occupied France. In retaliation, Hitler's scientists have developed unmanned, fantastic flying machines, V-1 rockets, also called buzz bombs or doodle bombs, that were launched by the Germans from somewhere along the French and Dutch coasts with just enough fuel to reach London and then randomly crash land somewhere in the city. London is constantly under attack. When these attacks first began, WACs were frightened and would seek protection in the air raid shelters. But soon they learned they could wait out the air raids in their apartments. The bombings became a part of their daily routine, and they just went on with their lives. Mollie feels that the people back home have no idea of what it is like in Europe. Here is the letter that she wrote home after Winston Churchill's speech telling the world of the German attacks by the buzz bombs. 26 July 1944, London, England. Dear Beck, by the way, I wasn't going to write to say I was in London because I knew you would all worry. And if you promise not to say anything to Mom and Pop, I will reveal a few interesting items. Restrictions on the doodlebug situation, as far as our mail is concerned, have been lifted somewhat since Churchill's speech. In fact, I could have written a few weeks ago about it, but held off. But now I have gotten to a point where I feel a lot of those people back home who sit back complacently ought to know there is a real war going on, and Beck, I see it every day. The air raid sirens are a frequent sound to us during the day as well as the night. And it means the real thing over here. Those darn buzz bombs come a-floating around. They have been our unwelcome visitors both day and night since approximately 1 week after D-Day. I am sure that many of the people I write to think, because I only write of pleasant things, that there is nothing else that enters into our little lives. I don't believe that people back home can grasp any part of the situation over here. I, of course, have many incidents to relate, which will have to wait until I see you. However, this one, through the courtesy of the censor, I know you will find interesting. One night, after a particularly busy day at the office, I was sleeping most soundly at our billets. It happened to be in the early days of those confounded things. Well, anyway, the roar was terrific, and yet I slept. I noticed a heavy feeling on my head and awoke drowsily to feel my bunkmate holding onto my hand and sitting on my bed. She had placed my helmet on my head, and we both listened for the darn motor to shut off. And fortunately, it didn't land where we expected it to. You can bet your boots we both felt to see if we were wearing our dog tags. Another sight always gives me a peculiar feeling and really penetrates. When I see the busloads of children being evacuated from London to safer places, having separated from their family and friends. Taking it all in all, it really is a great experience and certainly makes one appreciate the good old USA more than you can realize. I know you are anxious about me, but don't be, because for some reason, I am most calm about it. Even if I had the opportunity to go home right now, don't believe I would take it. No, not until this war is really over. She was among the first WACs to enter Normandy after the D-Day invasion. The WACs followed closely behind the fighting forces, slept in the field in tents, on army cots, ate field rations, and took baths in their helmets with cold water. She used her 4 years of high school French to converse with the civilians and learned about the terrible conditions that they had lived under the German occupation. She actually remembered her French. She actually paid attention in high school, learned and remembered her French. She was transferred to Paris 1 month after it was liberated by the Allies and frequently served as an informal interpreter in both work and social related situations. Here is an excerpt from another letter. Paris, France, 16 September 1944. Dear Beck, I know that you wonder how I'm getting along with the French language. I'm doing wonderfully well. In fact, yesterday, I acted as an interpreter. Last night, a number of us went to the Arc de Triomphe. We wanted to go up into it and see the view of Paris, but the guard there said we could not at that time as it was closed for the public. Perhaps later, he said. All that in French, and he could not speak one word of English. Then we walked away. We didn't get very far when I heard a shuffling of feet and turned around. There was the guard making a beeline for me with an Air Corps captain in his tow. The captain asked me if I could speak French, and I said a little. He asked me to ask the guard several questions, and I translated the answers. It was great fun, and I understood everything. They were trying to determine whether our pilots had flown any planes under the arc, which was against regulations. Anyway, the answer was no, at least for this guard. My mother enjoyed experiencing French culture because, unlike many of the Americans stationed in Paris during the war, she was able to understand enough French to go to French films and theater and to follow the dialogue. She also read the French newspapers and said that it added to her vocabulary. She was still stationed in Paris on VE Day, May 8, 1945, and took part in the revelry of the VE Day celebration in Paris. She commented in a letter written after VE Day that it's so wonderful to feel every plane flying over is friendly. Right after VE Day, my mother wrote home in a letter. Frankly, I don't know what the Army will do with us, but please don't think just because VE Day has been declared, all I have to do is run out to the docks and grab a boat home. The Army doesn't operate like that. Very soon after VE Day, a new theme appeared in my mother's letters, probably a theme in every soldier's letters, that of the point system. Although there was a point system for discharge, there could be other extenuating factors. Starting in June 1945, my mother wrote that stenos and typists have been declared essential in this theater, whether you have enough points or not. The point system theme continued in her letters home throughout July and August. She was still with medical intelligence, and they were the department who reviewed the extensive records that the Nazis left, claiming that their experiments were done to enhance medical research. They found that this was not true. After living in Paris, my mother was transferred to Versailles, where she lived a country life for about a month and even worked in a horse stable. The stable had been converted into offices for the US Army. My mother was always sending French perfume home to her family. Because she was working in a horse stable, her mother wrote to her and said, "Keep the perfume, you need it." In August 1945, she was transferred to Germany with the Army of Occupation and witnessed firsthand the devastation of the country. In a letter written from Frankfurt, my mother commented, "Although the European war has been over for some time, there is a great deal of cleaning up yet to be done. They are still digging through the debris in the bombed buildings. Frankfurt is still quite a mess, even though they say it has been all cleaned up. All the bricks have been piled high, so they make a fence around what used to be buildings." In September, Mollie writes again about points. "So what I want to bring out is this. I don't have one darn thing to say about it, and I am not kidding. I didn't want to go to Germany and just lacked 2 points. I saw colonels and captains galore. As far as being essential, stenos are no longer in that category." Finally, in early October, Mollie gets the word that she will be leaving Frankfurt to go home. After serving with the Army of Occupation in Frankfurt, my mother began her trek back to the USA in October 1945. She and other WACs took a train from Germany through France. They crossed the English Channel and arrived in London. Then they boarded the Queen Mary on November 3rd in Southampton. The Queen Mary, a luxury ocean liner built in 1936, but put into service in 1942 as a troop ship, was the fastest ship in the world. She was very useful during World War II because she could outrun the German submarines and torpedoes. My mother and her fellow servicemen and women, 11,000, including 400 female soldiers, set sail on the morning of November 4th. After less than 5 days at sea, my mother awoke at 2:30 in the morning on November 9th and went on deck to hear Tommy Dorsey and Martha Ray welcoming them home, and to see an illuminated Statue of Liberty in the midst of darkness. She knew she was home. I had a suitcase of letters that my mother wrote home. For some reason, her family didn't throw out her stuff. Included in that suitcase were lots of memorabilia. About 350 letters, newspaper clippings, and photos, which fortunately my mother had labeled with names, dates, and location. Writing a book based on letters from the 1940s was a formidable task. In order to actually be able to use these letters in a book, I needed to read them and transcribe them, about 1,000 pages typed. I also needed to be familiar with the content of the letters, so I would have a general idea of what I could edit out for a book. Nobody would want to read 1,000 pages of letters. It became a family project as my husband, sister, daughter, and son all helped. My uncle, my mother's younger brother, read the first draft. My mother said she didn't need to read the draft because she was there. Even as I was transcribing the letters, I began going to the Pritzker Military Library in downtown Chicago once or twice a week. Because of censorship, my mother could not write about her work or where she was located. Many letters indicated somewhere in England, somewhere in France. She could only write about pleasant events, sightseeing, and boyfriends. I had to investigate and put historical context around the letters so the book would put proper perspective of the events occurring at that time. Because of the historical nature of the subject matter, the head librarian thought it was important to find a traditional publisher and not to self-publish. A traditional publisher would vet the book and give credence to the accuracy of the information contained in it. In June 2008, she helped me find McFarland Publishers, a leading US publisher of nonfiction books located in North Carolina. They were planning on launching a series of books about women in the military, and they thought my mother's experiences would be excellent to begin their series. But then I didn't hear from them for quite a while. I also tried to contact the people who played a prominent role in my mother's life during the war. It was an amazing journey as I connected with some of the people or their children, and we have become email buddies and even Facebook friends. The close friendships that my mother formed with her fellow WACs were typical of the experiences of many women serving in the Army during the Second World War who found a special camaraderie there. Over the years, my mother corresponded with her 4 closest WAC buddies, including Lodo, sending birthday cards, Christmas greetings, and anniversary cards. But in October 2007, my mother received a letter from Lodo's daughter saying that Lodo had passed away. I think Lodo was the only other surviving member of my mother's close WAC friends. This gave me the impetus to begin this project and see it through to the end while my mother was still alive. And my mother was 91, so I knew I was living on borrowed time. I then contacted Lodo's daughter, Kathy, who lives in Hawaii, and we have been in contact ever since. She helped me fill in some of the blanks. When McFarland Publishers finally offered my mother and me a contract in May 2009, I had the book written, 150,000 words. We accepted the contract and they assigned us an editor from Wales. The publisher wanted at most 110,000 words, so we had some very serious editing to do. We communicated strictly via the internet. Through the miracle of modern technology, I never met my editor nor my publishers, and yet we negotiated a contract, edited, and published an entire book. My mother passed away in April 2012 at the age of 95. But seeing the smile on her face when she held her book in her hand was priceless. Peppered throughout her letters was the fact that she always wanted to write a book, and it happened only 65 years later. Working with my mother on this project was a very strange experience. It is impossible to know what your parents were like before they became parents. But using my mother's actual letters and photos felt like being transported by time machine to another era. Reading my mother's words and seeing photos of my mother as a young carefree woman who made decisions for herself and traveled the world during the most treacherous time of all made me realize the full life that she had before she became a wife and mother. I think so many of us never have the opportunity to see our mothers and fathers as well as people separate from the family. The woman in these letters was not the mother that I knew when I was growing up. She was a very different person when she got married and had a family. Sometimes we forget about the role that women played in the Second World War. Women stepped up and were able to make a significant contribution to the war effort, both at home and in the military. These American women showed courage in helping the fighting men, sharing in the disappointments of the soldiers, celebrating their successes, and finally rejoicing in the complete victory. They responded to the challenge and achieved their mission. They also served. With fewer and fewer of these female veterans still alive, this is a story that has its place in the history of women in the military. Thank you very much. I noticed there's quite a few comments in the chat.
Very good number of comments and questions, and I'm going to get right into that in just a second. I want to say thank you very much. Many thanks for sharing your mother's special story with us, Cyndee. Her experience helps us understand the history from a very personal angle. These are a lot of things that we've just learned in school, and we don't have that direct experience ourselves. And I think I can say for all of us that it was fun and educational to travel back to this period in our history, even for this brief time. And I'm going to get into the questions here now. First of all, somebody's saying bravo and much gratitude to your beautiful mother. Thank you and congratulations for preserving this important history in a book. And another wonderful presentation from Becky. Thank you so much for sharing. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to go back to the earliest questions and work our way down to the more recent ones. So Stacy asked, what are some good resources for researching the service of a specific WAC or WAV? My grandma was a WAV, but left behind very little information of her service.
I found by going to the Pritzker Military Library in downtown Chicago, they were very, very helpful. If you have your grandmother's discharge papers or something that might give a little bit of information about you, they have excellent resources there. They have people that are so helpful that are willing to work with you to help you find whatever you can possibly find. And I know there's a place in St. Louis that supposedly has all the records, but I believe there was a fire there. I don't know if it was in the 70s, the fire. And so they don't always seem to have the records, but the Pritzker Military Library is very, very helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Sarah asks, well, first of all, she says, thank you for your presentation. And then she asks, what did your mother say about her experiences being targeted with anti-Semitism during the war?
I don't know that my mother really had many experiences of anti-Semitism. You know, she didn't really talk about it much in her letters. And when I asked her things, she really didn't seem to find she had the anti-Semitism. I think maybe she was working in an office. Mm-hmm. It was different than if she had been on the battlefront, I think. So she didn't really talk much about anti-Semitism.
Jean asks, just curious, were the WACs given a rank? Did they have a ranking?
Oh yes, once they became part of regular Army. My mother was a sergeant in the WAC, so yes, she did have a ranking. She started out as a private first class, and she worked her way up and became a sergeant.
Great. Let's see. Katie asks, did Mollie ever go back to visit the places where she was stationed?
You know, she said, I think I had enough of it, and she never went back. And I think my dad really didn't want to go to Europe, and she wasn't going to go by herself. And her, you know, there's three of us. I have an older sister, a younger brother, and the three of us, we didn't really do much traveling till much, much later. And by that time, I'm not sure she really would have been able to travel.
Yeah. Since you mentioned your father, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Your father was also in the service. Did he write any letters home? Were there any letters saved from him?
Now that's an interesting story. Before my dad was sent overseas, he was in officer's training. He became a captain, and he knew he was going to be sent to China, Burma, and India. And he when he did go there, he took supplies across the Himalayan mountains. But before he went overseas, he sat down at his home in Chicago, and he wrote lots and lots of letters. He had 4 younger sisters, and he gave the letters to his sisters, to one of his sisters. His mother was foreign, so she didn't look at postmarks. And so he said to his sister, once I get overseas, I want you to send Mom a letter every couple of weeks so she knows she's hearing from her son. So his letters did not survive. I didn't hear about this story until after my dad had passed away, so I was never able to ask him anything about it. So, and they certainly were not reliable.
Yeah. Well, at least your mother survived, and that's good.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I'm going to just, let's see, take a few more comments here. Kimberly mentions that she had provided some information for Stacy too, to answer Stacy's questions about resources, and I've got those here. She recommends Lady in the Navy, The Way of the Waves, Women in the U.S. Navy, Making Waves. You can also check with the National Archives to request a copy of her naval service records. So that's all good information too, in addition to what you said about the Pritzker Library. So great. All right, thank you so much. Then someone else says, Bindi here says, I'm old enough to remember, though not old enough to have been able to serve. I found myself crying as I watched this. Thank you so much, Cyndee. I think that's really special. It really brought home what people sacrificed and what they did, and in ways that we wouldn't have ordinarily heard about. So thank you for that.
Right, and then they just came home and went back to their normal lives.
Right, right. And Vicki also says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Getting back to some questions, Denise asks, do you have any of the letters that your mother received? Did she keep any?
Yes, I do. And in the book, there are some of the letters that she received. She had a couple boyfriends, and at times when she was in different locations, different from a boyfriend, she received letters from them. She had letters that she received from her sister and from her brother, and even her sister's boss. My aunt was an attorney and worked for an attorney in Detroit. And the attorney in Detroit, my aunt's boss, sent my mother a letter, and my mother saved the letters I think that she felt she wanted to put in a book, because if you read her book, there were many times where she said, I want to write a book. So she had in mind what she wanted to do and which letters to save.
Right. Very interesting. How did your mother's parents feel about her service and joining the WACs?
Well, my mother was 27. So even though she was living at home, I'm not sure her parents could really say to her, you can't serve. Yeah. Her mother came over from the Ukraine, left and never returned to Ukraine, never saw any of her family ever again. But my mother's dad, when he came over, he brought most of his family over. So when my mother went to serve, my mother's dad, I guess, would cry every night, according to my uncle. He was very upset that his daughter was overseas. But because there weren't that many women serving, my mother, quite often, there was a picture of her in the newspaper. There was an article about her in the newspaper. And so my grandfather would take this article with the picture of my mother, and he would walk down the street and show it to everybody and say, this is my daughter. And he was just so proud of her.
That's great.
So
that's really great. Okay, I'm going to go, let's see. Katie is reminding us, and this is a good question too. Katie is reminding us, if you'd like to read Mollie's War, you can request the book from Edgewater Library. But if people would like to buy the book, where is the best place for them to buy it? And I'll post the link on the chat here.
Okay, they can buy it from Amazon.com, or if they want a signed copy, if they send me an email, and it's Cyndee Schaffer at gmail.com. Sending me an email, I will then send them the information. The book is $20 plus $3 for shipping.
Okay, could you repeat the price again? $20 plus
$20 plus $3 for shipping.
Great, I'm going to write that right down now.
So if they send me an email, then I will send them my address and everything.
Okay, great. I'm going to put.
Oh, and I guess, you know, we could even drop off books if people want to buy books and they don't want to spend the shipping. I can drop them off at the Edgewater Library, because twice a week we go into the city and we kind of go right past the Edgewater Library.
Okay, super.
So we can do that either way.
Great, great. So anyone who's interested in getting a signed copy, I've put the link to Cyndee's email address in here, Cyndee Schaffer at gmail.com. And you can write to her and she'll either mail you one for $20 plus $3 shipping, or $20 for the book, and perhaps arrange a drop off at the library. So I appreciate that very much. Okay. Getting back to some, let's see, I've got one more question coming from Judy. Deservedly, your mother was proud of her service. Did she share with you her personal feelings about what had happened in Germany?
She met people along the way who were affected by what happened. And by the time she got to Germany, there weren't the concentration camps anywhere near where she was. Mm-hmm. There was one family that she met in France, in Paris, that it was a woman and her son, and the woman's sister lived in Detroit. And the woman's sister in Detroit had contacted my mother's family in Detroit. And so my mother was able to spend time with the sister in France. Mm-hmm. And what had happened is that the woman in France, her husband and her son, they were all hiding out in France, because France wasn't a real nice country to the Jews during World War II. So they were hiding out, and I guess the husband went out early one morning to do something, and he never returned. So I think my mother kind of felt she needed to do something to help the cause.
Okay. I want to go back. I might have misspelled your last name, so I want to get it correct.
Okay.
Does it have an E, Schaffer? Is that correct? Okay.
That is correct.
I've gotten it wrong, so I'm going to go back and correct that. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. Disregard everything I just typed. I'm going to type that in just a second. First of all, I'll ask a question from Joanna. Where are all the letters, photos, etc. now? Have they been donated to the Pritzker or other library or museum?
They are right now sitting in my workroom. At some point, I will donate them to the Pritzker Library. They do want them. I just haven't been able to part with them. And I know that Pritzker told me that when I do finally give them the letters, they will make copies of them. So I will at least have copies of all of the letters. And they will keep the originals, the letters and the photos.
Good. Let's see. So Kimberly also mentions here, it's a question along the same line. Thank you so much for your comprehensive Veterans Day presentation. It was detailed and incredibly interesting. Could you tell us what you did with your mother's letters and papers? Since the WAC Museum closed at Fort McClelland, many of the World War II WACs have donated their papers to the Women's Army Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia. And these letters would be a treasure to World War II researchers of women's history. So that's something to consider too.
That is definitely
a comment from her.
Yes.
Okay, let me just check here for anything I might have missed. How did you, oh, this is a good one. This is coming from the Friends of the Edgewater Library. How did you learn your mother had served in the military?
Well, you know, like most World War II veterans, my mother and my dad, neither one of them really talked very much about their service. But my sister and I would wear my mother's uniform as a Halloween costume. So that's how we knew for sure that she served. Also, though, anytime we would be discussing World War II in school, and back when I was in school, you did spend a lot of time discussing World War II. My mother would have a letter or a photo or a newspaper article, something that was appropriate to whatever it was that we were discussing in school. So even though she would give us this information, she really didn't talk very much about her service. And I don't know, I guess we just didn't bother to ask the right questions either, because I know very little about my dad's service. Mm. And yet my dad was a captain, he was an officer. My dad stayed in the reserves until well into the 1960s. He retired as a major in the Army Reserves, and we never really asked him any questions.
Well, Joanna has another question here. How did your parents meet? Did they know each other before your mother joined the WACs?
Interesting story. Before the war, my mother was on vacation in South Haven, Michigan. She was from Detroit. My dad had 4 younger sisters, and one of his sisters was on vacation in South Haven, Michigan. And the 2 of them somehow became good friends. And my dad's sister would send salamis to my mother in Paris. So if you read the book, you will see that my mother had so many different boyfriends and so many different proposals, and she couldn't make up her mind. So she said, I have to go back to Detroit and think about it. Mm. So she was discharged, went back home to Detroit. My dad happened to have a sister living in Detroit. So on New Year's Eve, 1945, my dad's sister in Chicago set my mother and dad up on a blind date in Detroit. On their second date, my mother said to my dad, for 2 cents, I'd marry you. And as I move over, I don't know if you can see the 2 cents in that picture of my parents' love story. So those are the 2 pennies that my dad gave my mother. As I said, they didn't throw anything out. They got married 3 weeks after meeting, and they were together for 54 years till my dad passed away in 2000. And I guess when it's right, you know it's right.
Yep. Yeah. She didn't have to think about that one.
No, that one she didn't. Right, but she did keep in contact with one of the boyfriends. Back in sometime in the 90s, he contacted her. Mm-hmm. And they kind of kept in contact. And as I was writing the book, I did use him as a resource, but I was also very much worried about what he would think when he read the book. So he did read the book, and he said it brought back pleasant memories.
Oh, that's good.
So that was good.
Yeah. I have a couple more comments, and then I think we're going to wrap, and we'll open it up to everybody to stay on and chat with you for a few minutes.
Sounds good.
But first of all, Marcia, I wanted to make sure I got Marcia's out. She said, I liked when Over There played behind the wax boarding the ship on that little film that you played. And she also wanted to introduce herself. She was the staff member who wrote the review of Mollie's War for the Jewish War Veterans newsletter in spring 2011. So maybe
really?
you can chat a little bit
Thank
after all of this. Kimberly says, your parents' love story was a lovely story. So many World War II veterans have told me they had a lot of marriage offers, and it's amazing that they often had a lot of boys to choose from. And Becky adds that her father's a Vietnam vet, and up until recently did not talk at all about his time in Vietnam. So I don't think it's all that unusual that when they came back to the United States, they just wanted to move on with their lives. And it becomes important for us as children, but maybe not as easy or interesting for them to talk about after the fact. So kudos to you for getting all this down. I think that's a really important thing that you did.
Thank you.
Yep. And Tina, we have a couple of veterans. Kimberly and Tina are both veterans. Kimberly, I think, was in the WAC Corps, if I'm getting the two of you correct. So you guys will want to all chat afterwards. But Tina says, even veterans today, like myself, do not often talk about our service. So that's an interesting point. Again, Cyndee, I want to thank you very much on behalf of Friends of the Edgewater Library, Edgewater Village, Chicago, and the Edgewater Branch Library. Thank you so much for joining us today for this program on Veterans Day to honor not just your mother, but all veterans who have served. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.